Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 2, Day 6. But first, let's do our daily punishment. I lost my mood ring. I don't know how to feel about it. Your key terms for today are dun dun dun, the Bill of Rights, the Judiciary Act, Alexander Hamilton, the Revolutionary Soldier Controversy, also known as the IOU Controversy, the Assumption of State Debt, the First Bank of the United States, or the First Bus, the Necessary and Proper Clause, Whiskey Rebellion, Federalist, and Democratic Republicans, our first two political parties. We're going to go over the early policies of domestics of George Washington's presidency. Domestic policies means policies within the country. So that, like, for each president, they'll have domestic policies, laws they're passing for the country, and foreign policies. And we're going to talk about Washington's foreign policy next class. The economic policies of the brilliant Alexander Hamilton and the birth of political parties. The demographic support ideology of the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. So let's talk about some of the principles of the United States Constitution. Some of the principles in the Constitution will be popular sovereignty, the idea that the people rule. They got a lot of these ideas from the Enlightenment. The Founding Fathers were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. Popular sovereignty comes from Rousseau. The idea of federalism, the idea that states have some power and the national government has some power. Separation of powers and checks and balances, which we get from Montesquieu. James Madison is one of the first things he does when he enters the United States Congress and the House of Representatives is he's going to draft a Bill of Rights. He's going to be one of the big Federalist leaders at first, before he betrays them and stabs them in the back. The Bill of Rights will protect individual liberties against a strong national government. An acronym to remember the Bill of Rights is FATSET-JEPS. F is for the freedoms in the First Amendment. You have your freedom of RAPS, religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. You have A, the right to bear arms. You have T, no troops of soldiers. That was going against the Quartering Act. You have the Fourth Amendment, which is freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment is due process of law, no self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment is right of the accused person to a speedy and public trial. Seventh Amendment, right to trial by jury. Eighth Amendment, right from excessive, cruel, and unusual punishments. Ninth Amendment, just because it's not in the Constitution, there's other unenumerated rights that are still protected in the Constitution. The Constitution could not list every single right you have, so some of those are implied. You have a right to wear a polka dot dress. And the 10th Amendment is if it's not in the Constitution, those powers are reserved for the states. So a lot of people that support small government, states' rights, will use the 10th Amendment to justify saying that, like, the Constitution says nothing about education, so that should purely be a states' rights matter. Let's talk about some of the early precedents in George Washington's presidency. He will be elected unanimously the first president. One of the things that Congress does is they create the Judiciary Act, which will create a Supreme Court. At first, really, nobody knows what the Supreme Court does, so it's a really weak form of government. And a lot of Supreme Court justices actually leave it to get jobs in their states. At this time, most of the population was still mostly agricultural, rural. 95% of them lived east of the Appalachian Mountains in the former 13 colonies. One of the first things George Washington will do is he'll create a cabinet. For Secretary of State, who deals with foreign policy, he'll put Thomas Jefferson. For Secretary of Treasury, he'll put his buddy, his aide in the American Revolution, Alexander Hamilton, brilliant. For Secretary of War, he'll choose Henry Knox. And for Attorney General, he'll appoint his fellow Virginian, Edmund Randolph. Hamilton is going to realize that the biggest problem facing the new government, the United States Constitution, is they're in debt and they don't have any money. He's going to be the economic savior of America. He was a financial wizard who understood fiscal policy and understood how to get legislation passed. He thought by fixing the American economy, it will prosper for everybody. He's going to want to bolster national credit. One of the big things he's going to push for is that the national government is going to assume all state debt. So a lot of states owed money, and he wanted the national government to take that money and to owe it themselves. What that does is that creates buy-in for the new government. By the national government owning all the debts now, like everybody has like a buy-in for the government to be successful. A lot of the states with big debts like this plan, the states that did not own any money thought it was unnecessary and they thought it would give the government too much power. James Madison, who had supported Alexander Hamilton previously and been one of the biggest leaders of a strong central government, is going to oppose the assumption of state debt. Madison is going to turn against Hamilton and stab him in the back, metaphorically. One of the big other controversies is the Revolutionary Soldier controversy. During the American Revolution, the soldiers were given IOUs that when the government was stable, they would be paid back for the money they were owed. A lot of these soldiers thought they were never going to get the money anyway, so they're going to sell their IOUs to like speculators, to merchants, to bankers, and they'll get a fraction of what they deserve. People like Madison thought that we should give the money back to the people that originally had the contract, like the soldiers. Alexander Hamilton's going to be like, nah. Like he said that a contract is a contract. It's a legal document. It's unfortunate that these people sold their document, but the speculators also took a risk buying it, and we need to honor the actual contract. As far as the assumption of state debt goes, Virginia did not like the plan. It looked like Hamilton did not have the votes to get the assumption of state debts. So what's going to happen is Hamilton will be forced to make a secret deal with some of the people that oppose the state debt. He's going to meet with Madison and Jefferson. We don't really know what happened. What we have an idea is that in return for some of the people that oppose the assumption of state debt refusing to vote, so Hamilton will actually be able to pass it, Hamilton will agree that the capital will be moved from New York to a new city that will be located in between Maryland and Virginia, Washington, D.C., on the Potomac River. And this is the compromise that is going to happen. Hamilton will be the father of the national debt. The assumption of state debt will be passed. The more people the United States owes money to, the more people who would want the U.S. to do well. It's going to create a strong national government with strong economic powers. And even though it raises the national debt, it actually was a very important thing for making the country economically successful. And there he is. Look at him. So brilliant, so wise. Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton's economic plan was he wants to deal with the debt, which he does. He's going to want to gain revenue, which we'll talk about in a little bit. He's going to start putting tariffs on some internal goods like whiskey. And he wants to create a national bank. You know, so not all the states have their own banking system and not all the states have their own currency. So Thomas Jefferson, of course, is going to fail this. Thomas Jefferson, of course, is going to oppose this because it's Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton's going to propose the first bank of the United States. He says the government needs a strong box. They need to have a national currency. They need credit abroad. Jefferson will oppose it. He said that the national bank was not in the Constitution, so according to a 10th Amendment, it should be left to the states. Hamilton is going to say that in the Constitution, there are things that are not specifically in the Constitution that are allowed. So one of the things in the Constitution is there's a clause called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's also called the Elastic Clause because it stretches the power of the federal government. And it says that the government has powers. The Necessary and Proper Clause says that the government has powers to do things that are necessary and proper for its survival. And Hamilton said, look, bro, the bus is necessary and proper for our survival, so it is allowed under the Necessary and Proper Clause. George Washington is going to support Alexander Hamilton because his argument was much better. He'll convince Washington. The Bank of the United States will be created in 1791. Yeah, baby. Hamilton will put tariffs on internal trade to give money for the government. It was also meant to support some of the infant industries because America is starting to industrialize a tiny bit. One of the things they put a tax on is whiskey. In parts of Pennsylvania, whiskey was one of their major sources of import. Whiskey was used as a form of currency in Pennsylvania because they're drunks. So there's going to be a little mini rebellion called Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was the bunch of drunken farmers that are going to lead Whiskey Rebellion are going to argue for liberty, no more excise taxes. What's going to happen is Washington is going to put down the rebellion. He's going to lead an army, even though he's the president, and he will put down a rebellion. One of the way the Whiskey Rebellion is described is it's using a anvil, a huge hammer to destroy a little fly. It's a super overreaction, but remember, Shays' rebellion showed that the Articles of Confederation had no power. The government could not enforce its own laws. Whiskey Rebellion, conversely, will show that the Constitution actually does have power and it actually does work. That's one of the reasons why Whiskey Rebellion is so important. Here's Whiskey Rebellion. We're going to have the birth of political parties happening after this. A lot of this was tied to some people were opposing Hamilton's economic policies. They're also going to oppose Hamilton's ideas of foreign policy, which we'll talk about next class. But you're going to have the Democratic Republicans, the supporters of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and you'll have the Federalists. And here are some of their beliefs right here. The Federalists will be led by my boy, Alexander Hamilton. They will appeal to merchants, the urban people, the city folks, the educated. They want a strong government. They have a loose interpretation of the Constitution using the implied powers clause, necessary and proper. They support a national bank, excise tax, national debt. They'll favor the British as far as foreign policy goes. A lot of them traded with the British. The Democratic Republicans will be led by Thomas Jefferson and the traitor James Madison. They'll be favored by farmers, the South, the West, the less educated. They support states' rights. They support something called a strict construction of the Constitution. If it's not said in the Constitution, the government has no power. They were against the National Bank, against excise tax. They were against tariffs. And they're going to support the French Revolution and the French. So that leads us to the end of Washington's presidency. Next class, we'll talk about his foreign policy, and then we'll get to John Adams. That's all I have for you for today, guys. Until next time, deuces, 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 yeah.